Hello everyone, my name is Daniel and I'm a programmer and an artist, and I haven't made a whole lot of progress since the last video, but what I've been doing is taking these models I made and baking the textures and sort of making the final version of the asset. So I thought today we could do that on this next piece right here. So when it comes to exporting the final version of the asset, there's a couple different ways to go about it. Currently, the model has multiple materials, and each of those materials is a tiling material, and the UVs are all overlapping. So the first option you have is just to export it the way it is, with the multiple materials and the overlapping UVs. Some of the pros of that are it's fast, you don't have to make like another version of the mesh, because that's obviously fun. And then another potential pro is that, say, if you wanted to be painted white or a color or something instead of being just wood, all you should have to do is swap out the material in the wood slot with a painted wood or something. Some of the cons to it are you typically need a higher poly mesh because the normals of your geometry have to be perfect. You can't do any corrective things with a normal texture. Another con is that, for example, I put a tint on this material to make it darker. And this wood material is one that I use pretty often, so it's conceivable that I could have, walls on a building or some other wooden beams or something that have that same material, but maybe in that case I made it brighter or tweaked it in a different way. If they have the same name, it gets confusing then later in Unity trying to have the same materials match up and stuff. And then another downside is that for each material you have on a mesh, for a typical real-time rendering pipeline, each material will be rendered separately. So it'll first render the metal part of that mesh, and then it will render the wooden part of that mesh. So you end up, for one object, having to render it times the number of materials, essentially. And of course, that's sort of oversimplified. There's forward and deferred rendering and lots of different ways to batch draw calls together and stuff. So then another way to go about preparing the final model would be to make a high poly version of it, or at least a version of it where all the normals are really nice and everything looks neat, and then bake that result onto the really low poly mesh. Some of the pros of that are you can get away with a lower poly model because you can fix the normal problems with the normal map texture. You can bake a lot of extra detail into the normal map and also use ambient occlusion maps and stuff to get a better looking result. And then on the technical side, because all of the materials get merged into one, you can render the whole object in a single draw call. The downside of it is now you have a different material for each object. So it's whereas before all of these pieces of furniture shared the same 5 or 6 different materials. Now you have each mesh having its own material that renders in a single draw call, but you have textures for each individual object. But those textures do mean you get to put more detail on that object. So then you have to start to think about the resolution of those textures and the amount of memory they're going to use up a little bit. So another way, what I did on the lamps over here, I did it in a different file, but I made one texture that combined all of the materials I used on the lamps into a single texture. I can show it here. So this ended up being the texture for the lamps, where you had the 4 different materials that are used on it all baked into one texture. And then another cool thing about that is you could just change what textures are in that material to get different looking lamps, and then you can apply that texture to all of the different lamps. But obviously if you do that, then you can't bake normal maps, you can't do ambient occlusion because everything's overlapping. So anyway, all I have to say, it's my least favorite thing. It's way too complicated. You can spend a ton of time just thinking about it and never deciding which path to go down, because you're trying to consider all of the different, who knows what would be best in the end. So we may get down the line and realize I have too many textures and I have to try to combine some of these into one. But for now, what I'm doing is for these pieces of furniture, because they have these unique detail pieces and it would be hard to fit enough texture into one that's shared by all of them, I decided to bake unique textures for each piece of furniture. Whereas for the lamps, I made one texture that makes it a single material that all of the lamps share. Anyway, enough preamble. Let's go ahead and make the final version of this. So the first thing to do is just to make a copy of this object here. It has a collection to object node on it, and so we can just switch this to be the wardrobe 1 collection. Then I just give it an object offset so that I can position it in the world. Once I have that, I don't really need to do anything with it. It's just to merge everything into a single object, so we'll make a copy of it. and then just immediately convert it to a mesh. So now we have a single merged object with the whole piece in it. And if we ever need to make changes and start over, I would just delete that and start over. So then we need to make a UV layout where nothing overlaps. So we'll just make a UV2 UV map. Then just to start, to see what's going on, I'll just unwrap everything and see what sort of a result we get. Some things to look out for are pieces like this that make really bad use of the space in the layout. So I'm actually going to go through and just sort of separate these. Alright, and then once I've broken those apart into pieces that I feel like will not take up too much space, we can just select everything and make seams from the islands, which will add seams on all of these corners of this detail piece. Another thing we can do is with a piece like the handle here that we have multiple copies of, we can actually get rid of them. And then after, in the final version, we can copy the one including its textures and reuse it so they all share the same texture space because they're going to be identical anyway. So we have this piece here that's all one piece. I'm not even sure what that is. It must be the top. So we'll add a seam around the top here. And there we go, that helped with that a lot. So now we have this. Oh, I guess I see. So it's just this here is connecting it. So we'll add a seam there. That splits all that apart. All right, so it looks like everything unwrapped okay. I like all the islands look okay. I don't see anything that's too stretched or oddly shaped. So what we'll do now is we can select this back island. Because it's the back, I don't feel like it needs to take up that much space. So I'm just going to scale it to 2/3 of its size. And then let's see, is there anything else? I think that's all that needs to be scaled down in the UVs. I could maybe do the table legs, but then what I do is I pack the UV islands, which as of the new update works so much better. In a 3.6, they made packing UV islands a lot better. So once UVs are packed, we have this ready. We can make a copy of it. This is going to be our low poly, so now I like to name them. So we'll call this Wardrobe 1 High Poly, and we'll call this one Wardrobe 1 Low Poly. And then we can copy that name to the mesh data for later. Then on the low poly one, I clear all the materials, and I add the bake material. So then the bake material is just a principled shader with an image texture in it, and that image texture is where we're going to bake. That's this baker image, and it's currently just a new image. The other thing we can do is delete the original overlapping UV map and just keep our second UV map. So the way smooth shading works, you get these weird artifacts if you don't have enough geometry to define the shape, because it's interpolating like around corners. So from the side of this wood piece where they're pointing this way to the front of the glass piece where they're pointing this way, well then across the whole face it's going to blend between pointing sideways and pointing forward essentially. So that gives the weird effect where it looks like the glass is like bowl-shaped or concave when it's actually flat. Now you can fix that in several different ways. You can mark it sharp, you can use flat shading, you can use edge splits. But I guess the thing to be aware of with all of those methods is they make a really, really sharp, like infinitely sharp edge, which can be really obvious depending on the model. And like these, you're going to be far enough away, you probably wouldn't really notice it. So anyway, but in this case, I am using smooth shading and I'm baking a normal map. So we will add a bevel modifier to this. I'll set it to width. I like to turn clamp override off. Now we're just going to pick a small number like 0.003, something like that. If you go in flat shaded mode, sometimes it can be easier to see the effects of this. And then we're just going to pick like 4 for the number of segments. And you can really see the difference between how the normals look with the segments off, and then if you turn the segments up, the sides just get so much flatter looking. So now we just need to transfer that normal data and all of the material data to our new texture coordinates. So we'll do that by baking. When you're baking, if you have intersecting geometry, things get weird. So for example, right here, that would be problematic. So my way around that is with a node group I made called bake explode. So we'll add that. And basically all it does is it goes to, looks at the, well, it measures the bounding box to know how big the object is so that it spaces it far enough apart. And then it just takes each mesh island and moves it further along the x-axis so that nothing's overlapping anymore. So then if we bring our high poly back and we add explode to it, you can see it's laid out in the same way. Then we can just snap them to the same location. And now we can bake all of everything we want from high poly mesh to the low poly mesh without worrying about anything intersecting. And the only thing where that doesn't work is with the ambient occlusion pass. For the ambient occlusion pass to look correct, you want to turn the explode off. You also need to make sure that you explode before you bevel because for some reason it changes the order the islands get laid out in. So then as far as the actual baking itself goes, baking things in Blender is kind of annoying. You have to get all the settings set up right. You have to click on the image you want to bake to in each material that you're baking to so that it's the active one with the white outline. And then you have to bake the texture, which puts the bake result in an image that you then have to save. And essentially, I got tired of going through that whole ordeal whenever I wanted to bake something. So part of my random tools add-on that I haven't released is this baking tool. I feel like it's kind of specific to how I use it, so it might not be the most flexible, but I guess if people are interested in it, I could see about polishing it up and making it its own add-on. Anyway, the add-on attempts to automate several things. I've sort of told it the settings I want to use for different types of bakes. So it knows how to bake a base color map versus a roughness map. And then I've also told it how I want to name all those files so it can automatically save the files in a directory without having to manually save each bake. And then I ran into a problem that I didn't even know was a problem for a long time. I was getting inconsistent results from the bakes, but I didn't really notice it, and I wasn't really sure why once I did notice it. But it turns out if you use the metallic slider at all on any of your materials, then the color that's plugged into the base color slot gets split between the diffuse bake and the glossy bake. So if you have a texture plugged into your base color slot and you have a 50% metallic and then you bake a diffuse texture, the result of the bake will be 50% darker than the texture that was plugged into the base color. And the other half of that color from the base color will go to the glossy bake. And so you'd say, well, you should just bake combined then. But when you go to combined, you can't bake color. You can only bake direct and indirect. So there's really doesn't seem to be a good way around it. You kind of just have to bake everything from the emit bake type and then plug your value directly into the output or through an emission node. So then I just made it so you could name what an emit bake type was supposed to be. Because the other thing is you can't bake metallic. If you want to bake metallic, you have to run it through an emit bake type. But something that's really annoying about that is if you have multiple materials on an object and you just want to bake them all to a texture without using selected to active, then you would have to manually go through each material and plug, say, the metallic input into the surface output. So that left me stumped for a little bit, and it was still a pain to bake things. But then the other day I had an idea, and I was like, well, if you knew what the shader was in each material, then you could go through the inputs on the shader and just figure out what was connected to it, even if it wasn't plugged into the material output, and you could create that value or you could connect the same thing directly to the output. So after that I came up with this idea of this preview button where you could go through all of the selected objects and all the materials in all the selected objects, find the shader, and then connect whatever input on that shader you selected directly to the material output. So we could say preview roughness, and it will reconfigure all of the shaders to connect whatever is plugged into the roughness on the shader to the surface output. or you could preview metallic. Metallic doesn't have an input, it's just a value, so it will create or repurpose this RGB node to be that value and connect that to the surface output. And so that actually worked out better than I expected. So then the only tricky part about it is how do you determine which node in the node tree is the shader? So you can either give it a label. If it can't figure it out, that'll sort of explicitly tell it this is the shader node, or it looks for the node that has the most things connected to it as inputs, or the most used inputs essentially. And also works with groups. If you have, I always make different sort of shaders with some calculations inside of it before the principled node, and so it can work inside of that group and create a bake output that's just a color. And anyway, all that, I guess, just to explain why I have this extra panel here. So it takes the name of the object data as what it's going to name the texture, and then it will append like underscore base color to that name. Anyway, I feel like I probably over-explained that, especially because it's not available right now, but we can just bake the base color. It'll also detect that I have two objects selected, and that only one of them has a bake image on it. So it will, based on that information, realize that this time I want to bake selected to active. Whereas if you selected multiple objects that all had material with a bake image in it, it could bake all of them to one texture. Or if you select a single object, it'll realize, oh, I don't have two objects. We don't want to bake selected to active, we just want to bake whatever's on this material currently. So then the bake's done. You can see the file's named in my assets folder. I should have a new image here. Saved automatically. I didn't have to do anything. So then we can just bake the roughness. And then we can bake the metallic. And then we can bake the normal map. Then we can select the high poly version. We can turn off the explode modifier and put it back because we're done with it. And then we can make sure to turn off the rendered mode as well, because it will bake whatever the rendered settings of modifiers are. And we can collapse this back. We can make sure it's moved far away from everything to bake ambient occlusion. I think ambient occlusion depends on the normal, so we'll go ahead and open up the normal map that we made. It should be a non-color image, and we can plug that into the normal of our object, and you can see how nice. You can see the difference between without the normal map and with the normal map. And then with just the single object selected, we can just bake ambient occlusion. It'll automatically know to turn off selected to active because there's only one, and we'll get the ambient occlusion map. I think ambient occlusion takes the longest to bake of all the different types. Then once that's done, we can just snap it back over here. We can get rid of the bake material, make a new material. We can add an image. We can open our base color texture. We can run get material textures. This operator is in my utilities add-on. It'll bring in all the materials. Should set all of the settings correctly. And there you go. Oh, one other thing we need to do, because we deleted them, is we should go into edit mode, make sure correct face attributes is off. We should select our handle here. Make sure we have all of it, and we can just make a copy of it. Move it down here, get rid of the keyhole. And I guess the only thing we didn't do, the only thing wrong about that is the ambient occlusion on the drawers might be a little bit off because they weren't there, but there you go. That's the sort of boring and laborious process of remaking the thing that you already made and baking textures for it. So hopefully that was interesting. I guess let me know if you think you would like to use the bake add-on, and I could maybe see about polishing it up and making it a finished version. And then other than that, if you haven't seen them already, I've got some geometry nodes and other tools which are all available on Gumroad, so check those out if you haven't. And then yeah, that's all I've got for this one. Thanks for watching.